So we're here once again for another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. This time it's a solo episode. We're definitely going to be continuing interviewing people or talking to people about different topics that will help inform just our general understanding, not only of osteopathy, but of healthcare in general, healthcare education, and whatever subjects we end up wandering off into. This time, what I'm going to do is take you through an example of how things that seem sophisticated may not necessarily be exactly what they claim to be. And a lot of this is based on really, really simple mistakes in application of the philosophy of science, right? So you're going to see essentially a relationship proposed, then built upon, right? So you're going to see what is probably a faulty relationship proposed through some form of observation. So there's an a priori concept, or a priori being that which can be known without sensing. So there's this concept that, this thing and this thing go together. We measure them. There's a relationship between them as far as how we record them. There's maybe problems with the recording. We'd have to ignore that. But then, well, we don't have to ignore that. We have to talk about that, at least for the purposes of what we're going to do here. And then there is a buildup upon that possibly or very likely faulty initial observation and claim that is able to then permeate through a profession as something that is sophisticated. Now, I'm not necessarily simply trying to pick on those that are interested in the cranial concept. I am using it as an example, and because I have a history of talking about the cranial concept as not being what it claims to be, or at least the claims that it makes not being what they are actually claiming, right? Or the claims that they make are not actually observable in their work for patients may likely be observably stable and have a generally positive range of outcomes, but the claims are kind of nuts, right? So we'll look at an example within the cranial concept of attempting to explain some physiological mechanism that they believe the cranial practitioners will be noting, or that there's a relationship between the two, and we'll work through that. Anyways, instead of just mumbling on, tell you what I'm going to do, I might as well start to do it. So there's a way in which we're going to some degree, move backwards. So I'm just going to take a moment and enlarge this window here. So what I want to do is note that I'm pulling from a website. I am not saying anything negative about what is said on this website, but I'm using this website as an example of how something that is in peer-reviewed literature can be used appropriately based on what it claims by those who are consuming it. So you can use the claim appropriately, but if there's a problem with the claim, it's not necessarily detected when you consume it and use it. So this is osteodoc.com, and this is an article that they have up on cranial bone mobility. Yeah, so it's osteodoc.com/cranial-bone-mobility/ right, whatever, if you want to look for that, if you're only listening and not necessarily seeing the video. There is a good description of what is identifiable in the literature here. It is very well resourced, right, or very well referenced. So when I scroll down to the bottom of this page, you're going to see the references, and it goes from 1 to 38, and it's appropriately cited. It's well done, talking about observations with respect to cranial bone mobility. Now, there's a bunch in here that is really focused on animal studies, and animal studies are often reasonably well related to human function, but sometimes they're not, so you have to have the appropriate model. I'm not making commentary on that. I'm making commentary on how this particular website put out an article that has consumed that information properly, made reasonable claims based on that information as it's consumed, coming out of peer-reviewed literature, properly referenced. This is well done. But there's a problem, and that problem primarily lives within how the literature, or a portion of the literature that I'm going to focus on, has mistakes in it that are then present in what is being written. So if there's a fundamental error in something, anything that's built on top of that contains that fundamental error. Now, in this case, what we're going to look at is the Traube-Herring-Mayer wave. Now, the Traube-Herring-Mayer wave is more accurately today termed how do I get this thing to do what I want it to do? Is more accurately termed Mayer waves, or that's what you'll hear it termed as. And hold on. It's not working the way I want it to. Okay, there we go. I got something. So what I'm going to do is move this. So it's more, like I said, Traube-Herring-Mayer wave, identified sometime in the 1800s by Traube and Mayer, or Traube and Herring, and then Mayer may have come later. Either way, you've got this concept of an oscillation in blood vessels, right? So there's a rhythmic oscillation in blood vessels. This rhythmic oscillation was noted in some way in the 1800s. So there was some form of observation there, and then that was built upon. Now, the observation may not likely have been recorded in a way that we would accept today, but it was recorded in some way. So you have to accept that there was an observation of some form of rhythmic change in an actual blood vessel or change in flow. I don't know how they would have detected change in flow in the 1800s. They likely could have found some way, not 100% sure. But anyways, in 2006, I'm kind of working backwards here to show you how this happens. So we have the OsteoDoc webpage with the article. I'm not going to say anything negative about the article again. They did their job properly based on what's in peer review literature. What you get in 2006 is an article in the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association called Recording the Rate of Cranial Rhythmic Impulse. And I'll just read some really quick stuff here. So the rate of the cranial rhythmic impulse can be obtained by both palpation and instrumentation. However, literature has reported higher rates obtained by instrumentation compared with palpation. The cranial rhythmic impulse has been demonstrated to be synchronous with the Traube-Herring oscillation measured in blood flow velocity. The current study demonstrates that physicians tend to palpate the cranial rhythmic impulse and Traube-Herring oscillation in a 1-to-2 ratio. So 1 cranial rhythmic impulse to 2 Traube-Herring oscillations. This finding provides an explanation for the difference between palpated and instrumentally recorded rates of the cranial rhythmic impulse. So that's basically making a claim that we can trust that the cranial rhythmic impulse can be palpated, and that the Traube-Herring oscillation in some degree can be palpated and measured, and that when you measure the cranial rhythmic impulse, you get one reading, and then when you, like, there's just a bunch of stuff kind of coalescing here, for lack of a better way to say it. There's a bit of mumbo jumbo in that. Now, obviously, that's a very quick hit. That would be an abstract, so that's not completely giving you what supports the statement. Now, what I want to do is really quickly, what I want to do is just look at the methods here. So I don't have the full paper up here, but I do have the methods. It's a very, very short methods description, which is a challenge in and of itself. So for those who would like to repeat this, they'll have a hard time, right? The methods simply state the palpation of the CRA by osteopathic physicians skilled in the methods of cranial osteopathy was compared with simultaneously recorded laser Doppler flowmetry. So you have to believe, for any of the claims here in this paper to be accurate, you have to believe that palpation of the cranial rhythmic impulse is accurate and reliable. So it's valid, right? So that you can, it's actually doing what it says it does. So when a practitioner claims that they're feeling something, that they are feeling it, they haven't told you that they are measuring, they're taking the report from the practitioner, claiming they feel this impulse, and a measure of the impulse itself. They're measuring something else. They're measuring the laser Doppler flowmetry. So they're measuring the velocity of blood in a particular area. So you have to also assume that the claim that they're making about the movement of the blood or the flow of the blood is accurate. I would say that's not a terribly difficult claim to believe, but you have to believe it. The one that's the real problem is believing that the cranial rhythmic impulse notation that the practitioner is giving you is actually accurate, because you're not measuring it. You're measuring a relationship between when they claim and when something completely separate is happening. So there's a problem there, right? So they're saying that you can palpate or record the cranial rhythmic impulse or palpate the cranial rhythmic impulse. There's nothing of the sort to be found in this paper. It is not doing what it says it is doing, right? So that's the 2006 paper. Now let me see if I can make this thing work right again. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. It's just a bit of a nuisance when, there we go, I can do that. When I'm trying to skip through some of the tabs that I have open. We'll leave it this way. Please excuse me as I struggle through this. Okay, so the next paper is a 2002 paper. All right, now the 2002 paper is the effect of cranial manipulation on the Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillation as measured by laser Doppler flowmetry. So you can see that if we go back in time from the 2006 to the 2002 paper, the claim that the laser Doppler flowmetry can do what it's saying it's doing and give you that 1 to 2 relationship. So 1 cranial rhythmic impulse to 2 Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillations. They've done previous work on it. Now, when we look into this, so it's the abstract again that we have. So we don't absolutely have the full paper to look at here. So we're making some extrapolation. We have the first paper available to us, and we'll get to that in a moment. So the context correlation has been established between the Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillation in blood flow velocity measured by laser Doppler flowmetry and the cranial rhythmic impulse. So we'll tell you how they did that in the next paper that we look at, which is the paper that they built on. Now, the objective is to determine the effect of cranial manipulation on Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillation. Design of 23 participants, 13 received sham treatment, 10 received cranial manipulation. Setting, Osteopathic Manipulative Medicine Department, Midwestern University, Downers Grove, Illinois. Participants, healthy adults, subjects of both sexes. The intervention, a laser Doppler flowmetry, they didn't even put the L in there. Laser Doppler flowmetry probe was placed on the left earlobe of each subject to obtain a 5-minute baseline blood flow velocity record. Cranial manipulation consisting of equilibration of the global cranial motion pattern and cranial cervical junction was then applied for 10 to 20 minutes. The sham treatment was palpation only. Main outcome measure, immediately following the procedures, a 5-minute post-treatment laser Doppler was recorded. Recording was required. For each cranial treatment subject, the 4 major components of blood flow velocity record, the thermal, which is the Mayer signal, the baro, the Traube-Herring signal, the respiratory signal, and the cardiac signal were analyzed. The pre-treatment and post-treatment data were compared. 10 participants who received cranial treatment showed the results is the 10 people who received cranial treatment showed a thermal signal power decrease from 47.79 to decibels to 38.49 decibels. I believe it's decibels. The baro signal increased from 47.40 to 51.30. So the temperature went, you would say, went down. The barometer or the pressure went up. The respiratory and cardiac signals did not change significantly. The manipulation effects of the blood flow, cranial manipulation affects blood flow velocity oscillation in its low-frequency Traube-Herring-Mayer components, but these low-frequency oscillations are mediated through parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. It is concluded that cranial manipulation affects the autonomic nervous system. So it would have been nice, at least in this, not having the full paper, to see the report of what happened with the sham treatment. If there was changes in the sham treatment, which was palpation only, then it would be of interest. It just as a comparison. But essentially, you have a method that they're claiming is accurate, and then they're showing you changes on those measures. Now, the changes on those measures are notable, right? But the way that they did the conclusion, they didn't measure any proxies for the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. They noted a change, and they looked into the literature and said that the Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillations are mediated through the nervous system, being both parasympathetic and sympathetic, at least, or the autonomic nervous system. So they took that piece of information that other people had found, and then they said, because we made a change with the cranial manipulation, and we saw a change in the Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillations, we must, through cranial manipulation, be then affecting the autonomic nervous system. They didn't observe that. They filled that in with previous information. What you would want to do is you would want to actually observe some proxy for the changes in sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. Now, what they're going to claim is that the proxy is the change in the Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillation. And fair enough, but to increase your confidence to actually be able to make the claim that the cranial manipulation is affecting the autonomic nervous system, you might want some more proxies. So you might want to measure things in other places or other proxies of alterations in autonomic nervous discharge or autonomic nervous activity. Now, the fact that they didn't see much change in respiration or in cardiac rate or heart rate rather would suggest that they were measuring some other proxies and they didn't see changes. So they saw changes in the flow, right? So in the temperature and in the pressure, but they didn't note any changes in heart rate or respiration, which are two other proxies for autonomic activity. So if they're in their own data set, they did not see consistent changes in autonomic output. So we have an open question. So they made a claim that is not supported by the data that they presented, unfortunately. So now we'll go to the paper where they established their methodology, right, which is a 2001 paper. This is the same author group kind of the whole way through, right? This is from 2001, cranial rhythmic impulse related to the Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillation, comparing laser, Doppler flowmetry, and palpation. So we'll definitely look at the methods here. So we're going to walk through the methods just so that you understand how they establish this relationship and the challenges with that, establishing that relationship, such that even if, let's just say, the subsequent paper where they made an autonomic nervous system claim in relation to cranial manipulation without seeing that fully in their own data, that there's a problem. Even if that was accurate, there's a problem with the base level measurement, okay? So the methods: subjects, 12 healthy subjects over 18 years of age, 6 males, 6 females, non-pregnant, were recruited from the faculty and students of the Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine, Midwestern University, Downers Grove, Illinois, all signed IRB, Integrated Review Board approved informed consent forms. Conditions and protocol. Cranial examinations were performed by one of the authors in sequence in one day in a quiet, essential for instrumentation, small office with low-level illumination, provided by incandescent lighting and an ambient temperature of approximately 20 degrees Celsius. Prior to each examination, an adhesive Doppler probe was placed onto the left earlobe of each subject. I'm just going to briefly break here. This is important because this is actually a good method section. They're telling you all the steps they took. So when you're tracing through a line of literature, if you get back to the first paper, say the third paper or the fourth paper, the methods section is not a good description. If you go back a little bit further, you may find a good methods description. So this is actually a good methods description. So we'll go back into it. Following this, each subject lay quietly on the examination table for approximately 5 minutes prior to the onset of data acquisition. It was essential that the probe and leads were free of tension so the earlobe blood flow was not compromised. Laser Doppler flowmetry provided measurement of the relative velocities of blood, hemoglobin, while simultaneously the examiner at the head of the table palpated the cranial rhythmic impulse using light touch with the hands in a biparietal hold position. So both hands on the top of the head. Both examiner and subject were blinded to activities on the computer screen and keyboard. That just means that they couldn't see what the heck was happening with the computer. A 2-minute long equilibration period record was recorded. Following the equilibration period, the examiner would use a subdued voice, enunciate F at the instant a cranial flexion event began, and a second investigator operating the computer console in the examination room would press the key entering the first event mark into the digitized flowmetry record. What that means is every time, so they said it quietly, the person palpating would just say F, or it would sound more like for flexion and for extension. And then the person on the keyboard would hit the key just to mark it. And then what they're doing is overlaying that on the readout of the laser, or the Doppler, right? The Doppler laser or laser Doppler. Thereafter, serial extension and flexion events were marked into the record. This method of recording could introduce 150 millisecond reaction time delay into the CRA record. 300 milliseconds of reaction times of both the examiner and the recording investigator are considered. Continuous unbroken records of approximately 5 minutes duration were recorded for each subject. So what they're talking about with that reaction time is, if I'm palpating, I may take some time from feeling to saying. So I feel something and then I say it. So there's a reaction time built in there. And then there's a reaction time built in to the person on the keyboard hitting the key. Now, why that matters is because you're going to have to shift the event to the record. So you're going to have to adjust your time scale. So there's going to be something on the laser Doppler record and then there's going to be the record that's entered by the person on the keyboard, and there's going to be some lag time. So they're going to time shift it. Now, they may time shift it at 150, they may time shift it at 300, and what they'll probably do is they'll time shift it at 150 and see if it matches what they think it should match, and if it doesn't, they'll time shift it to 300, or they may shimmy it around a little bit. Now, we're not going to go deeply further into this paper for the purposes of talking about this, but what we're going to do is stay right where we were with respect, or where we've gotten to with respect to the methods. This is where I noted in the first paper that I showed, where they were talking about recording cranial rhythmic impulse, that you have to trust that the practitioner is feeling what they say they're feeling. You have to assume that with hands on the top of the head, the practitioner can feel something occurring in only the cranial bones. They're not getting any reflected information or palpatory sense from the patient being on their back with their head fixed to the table and their thorax fixed to the table and their neck to some degree free. And every time they breathe, you're going to have some very, very minor motion of everything, right? So because the neck is free and the thorax is going to expand and contract or change its geometry or relationship to the table, that's going to transmit through the head. What you would have to do to believe that somebody was feeling just movement of the head is you would have to somehow control for respiration and the movement that it would transmit into the cranium, into the practitioner's hands. You'd have to control for that, and I've never seen that done. It doesn't mean it hasn't been done. I've never seen it done, because I don't know how you would have somebody not breathe for a reasonable period of time and then feel pulsations. But then you'd have to say those are abnormal pulsations because the person should be breathing in and out regularly. So you have problems for controlling for this. But you have to trust that what the person says they're feeling is what they're feeling and what's actually happening. They're saying that hands here, they're feeling something happening with the sphenoid, or between the sphenoid and the occiput, right? They're feeling that as transmitted through the rest of the cranium. And they're not feeling, or they're not claiming, the respiratory cycle as transmitted from the thorax into the head through that free neck and just movement on the table. So because we can't trust in a meaningful way the claim of the practitioner for these flexion extension events, overlaying them on the laser Doppler flowmetry doesn't end up meaning much. So just because you get a claim and a reading that gives you this 1 to 2 relationship doesn't mean it's legit. You have a questionable measure in the palpation of the cranium. It's a very questionable measure. So to then build up and say that you can palpate the cranial rhythmic impulse is an unsubstantiated claim. It is not present in the data that we have from these authors, right? So this is how you get this chain going along from what might be, what seems like a reasonable claim. So you get the OsteoDoc article on cranial mobility, and they do a good job of piecing through the available literature. The problem is the literature, right? This is where we run into some interesting things. So if you haven't done the fundamentals right, then anything you build on top of the fundamentals is going to carry the problems with what you've done. So we'll switch to one more article, and we'll talk about the actual Mayer waves, right? Or what is understood at the top level about Mayer waves within today's scientific literature. And this is from 2019. This is an update on the enigma of Mayer waves. So they don't call it Traube-Herring-Mayer, they call them Mayer waves, right? So within the physiological community, these are Mayer waves. This is from Cardiovascular Research, volume 116, issue 14, on the 1st of December, 2020, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, published, that's weird. Whatever. Anyways, we're going to read a little bit from this. So, more than a decade from having published my 2006 review paper on Mayer waves, I noted a cursory Google search that it continued to garner attention and interest. For this reason, I deemed it useful and perhaps timely to write a brief update suggesting some pointers for future research in this fascinating area. Okay, so the thing that we really need to look at is this first section, which is the definition of Mayer waves. And so we're going to read this. For a start, it is interesting to examine the career of the term Mayer waves. In 2006, I proposed, for the sake of convenience, that this term be reserved to blood pressure oscillations slower than respiration and correlating, i.e. coherent, with synchronous oscillations of a peripheral sympathetic nervous activity. So it doesn't say which peripheral sympathetic nervous activity, it just says peripheral. So however, the term has often been used ever since to qualify almost every cardiovascular or autonomic oscillation slower than respiration. Even when it was reserved to blood pressure, it could be read that Mayer waves can be observed at frequencies as low as 0.03 hertz, while, to the best of my knowledge, coherent oscillations of sympathetic nervous activity and blood pressure have never been recorded with such low frequencies in humans. In order to avoid confusion and misinterpretations, I reiterate my initial suggestion of defining Mayer waves as sympathetically mediated oscillations of blood pressure slower than respiration. It is also important to recall that we are talking about oscillations, i.e. rhythmic fluctuations of blood pressure with a fairly regular frequency. These oscillations must therefore appear as a peak in the spectra. The absence of such a peak, even in the presence of measurable spectral power in the band, points to the absence of Mayer waves. For example, after sinoaortic baroreceptor denervation in rats, there is no longer a peak in the frequency band containing Mayer waves, but there is still spectral power, about 1/2 measured in control rats, power then appears as continuation, blah, blah, blah. What's important there to take away is that there is some reporting of Mayer waves or Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillations that may not actually fit, or that are claimed without an organized definition. So if you're going to make a claim on something, there should be at least some agreed upon definition. The definition being provided, or maybe not being provided, in the series of papers in the osteopathic field that we've shown you so far don't necessarily have a meaningful definition presented of what a Mayer oscillation or a Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillation actually is. The person writing this paper is suggesting one. So what you need to understand is that when you're looking at papers with a Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillation or a Mayer wave, that if they don't use a clear definition, there's nothing meaningful in the claim, or if there is something meaningful in the claim, it can't be as the claim is made. You may have to reformat your definition or your explanation in relation to the data. Okay, so there's lots more stuff in this, but what I really want to attempt to be clear on is that I've taken you through an arc. So from the general report, something that's kind of percolating in and out of a profession or through a profession, in that OsteoDoc article, they did good work. When they're talking about, in their article, Traube-Herring-Mayer oscillations, they're relying on research that has problems. Now, they may not have necessarily had the time, or maybe didn't notice the problems with that research, but any claim that they make on the research arc that I took you through, the 2006, the 2002, and the 2001 papers, talking about laser Doppler flowmetry and cranial, or identifying the cranial rhythmic impulse from palpation on the parietal bones, if they didn't pick up on those problems, then their claim can't be valid, right? Now, they did their job the right way, aside from checking the validity of the research that they're building their claim on. So I'm not knocking anybody here, but I'm saying, if you've done a bad job at the fundamentals of science, or the fundamentals of hypothesis generation and observation, then any claim you make is going to have the mistakes you made in it. And it won't always be immediately apparent until such a point as it meets a set of circumstances that make the mistake apparent. So we'll all make mistakes. When we make mistakes, we don't know we made them. Sometimes they're easier to identify, and sometimes it's very useful to have somebody that is not the person making the mistake identify the mistake. That's why external eyes or external observation is very useful for most of our behaviors, because other people can see mistakes that we don't know we're making. But when you're talking about the general understanding within a profession, if there's flaws in it and you don't know them, then you will keep building on those flaws. It's one of the reasons that I'm very interested in the fundamental concepts of how to make an observation, generate a prediction in the form of a hypothesis that can be tested, and try to test it in a way that you could break your prediction, right? So you're not trying to prove your prediction, you're trying to break your prediction. So this is why I'm very, very interested in the philosophy of science, because when you're looking at a profession such as osteopathy, there's a lot of claims within osteopathy that have fundamental flaws that are not hard to find if you understand the fundamentals. Now, I will reiterate, the behavior of osteopathic practitioners clinically is very good, very positive. It's helping a lot of patients. The claims are absolute nuts most of the time. Hopefully that wasn't too cumbersome to listen to in the way that I'm talking about very technical details. Hopefully you find it interesting. Hopefully you find it useful, and we'll talk again soon.